Well, good evening, everyone, or whatever time it is where you are. It's 9 o'clock where I am. I'm in North Carolina tonight. Um, Unfortunately, Nancy Lord is having technical difficulties and she hasn't been able to get on yet. So I am just going to interview myself. I'm just going to talk and read some poems, and it's really great to see everyone. Hi, Antonia. Hi, Irene, Carolyn. Hi, Lisa. Oh, it's really great to see so many friends here. Oh, and Carolyn, my sister, who's just out in the other room. I'm sitting in her house tonight. Allison says there's no sound. Is anyone else having sound issues? Okay, it's good for everyone else, Allison. Okay. Um, so welcome to my reading / conversation about my book, Tender Gravity. Um, Nancy had sent me some questions, so I'm just going to speak from some of the things she asked me to talk about. And the first question was what role poetry plays in my life, and that before I've written prose, and this is the first poetry book I've published. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. I didn't really read poetry until later in life, and the first poet I read was Mary Oliver, and I know that's familiar for a lot of people because her poetry is so accessible, but also because it really spoke to me. And I think that's the thing about poetry is you have to find the right poet in the right time and place that speaks to you, and then it's like you understand it. So I started reading poetry when I started to do more writing, but I was still writing prose. But I read poetry because one poet who's one of my favorites, her name is Jane Kenyon, she had some advice to writers, and one of them was have good sentences in your ears. And I don't know of any finer sentences than the ones that come in poetic form. So I started to read poetry every morning. It was sort of one of the first things I did when I woke up, and I try to continue that practice more or less. And then I also read about the poet William Stafford, whose work really inspired me too, that he would write a poem every day. And he would wake up every morning and write a poem. And I thought, well, that's good writing practice, right? Because to be a writer, writing is like a muscle. You have to exercise it. You have to use it regularly in order for it to be strong. And so I just started this practice of, say, on November 1st, I'd start a new file on my computer, November 1, and I'd just write a poem. And I wasn't really thinking of doing anything with them. It really was just writing practice for me for a long time. And then some of the poems started sounding kind of good. And so I started sending them out. And Cirque Journal, that's published in Alaska, was the first journal that published a poem of mine. And I'm always thankful to them for that, for getting to see a poem in print. And then I just kept sending them out, getting them published here and there. And I thought, well, maybe someday, I'll try putting it together into a manuscript. And then my good friend, Lisa Couturier, who is here tonight, said, well, I think you have a book. Just go ahead and do it. And I think I needed that push from someone else to say, yes, you do, And so then I started putting this book together. And so poetry is just, I think it's just a beautiful practice to read it and to memorize poems. People used to do that. They used to carry lines around in their heads. So that's a little bit about my journey with poetry. Another question that Nancy asked me is about the title of the book, Tender Gravity, and to read the first poem in the book, where the title of the book comes from, The Beating Heart Minus Gravity. I'm going to go ahead and put that on share screen so you can see it, because the form of a poem is as important too. And I'll just read this one to you. The beating heart minus gravity. When I was a young girl, I wondered what flying would feel like. The kind where you stroke through air like water. That's why I loved to swim, loved most of all to dive deep and then arc up toward bubbles rising to the bright light. But now and again, I dream of diving to the blue depth and rising, following bubble after bubble, seeing golden sunlight glinting above, but never reaching, no matter how hard I kick, the tender gravity of air. So the book starts with a poem from my childhood, growing up in North Carolina. We spent a lot of time in the water in summer, sliding down Sliding Rock, or the natural pools in the streams, or at the swimming pool. And I love to swim. And then the poems in the book move pretty quickly towards another form of water, which is the glaciers and the ice of Alaska, where I learned to love to kayak. And so I see this sort of flowing with water throughout the book. And the title, Tender Gravity, when I was putting the book together, I wasn't really sure what I was going to call it, but this idea of tender gravity hints at one of the overarching themes of why I write in all my writing, and that is how lucky we are to be on this gorgeous planet. How lucky we are to be held here by gravity, and that tenderness of the loving care of this planet Earth that provides everything we need. So I just, that's why that title really spoke to me. And starting with this poem, starting with a childhood poem, this feeling of being untethered, as we may often feel in childhood. We're not really sure who we are yet, and seeking. And seeking is really a theme that runs through all my work, especially the poetry. And it's also interesting to note, I know some of you have already read the book, so you may have noticed this, but the first poem ends with air, and then the last poem in the book ends with air too. And there's hopefully a progression in the book towards some grounding in that all this beauty and sorrow and everything that life throws at us on this beautiful planet. So that's just a little bit about where the title came from. And what I'm going to do, because I can tell Nancy's not going to make it, and I feel like it would be more interesting to have a conversation than to just have me talking at you. What I'd like to do is ask if any of you have questions that you would like to ask me now, or anything you'd like for me to talk about in relation to the book, of course, not everything in general. Well, think about it. I'll ask again in a minute. I wasn't really planning on being a one-woman show. Let me just read another poem.
Well, Marybeth, I have a question. I'm sorry, I had a hard time getting my mouse to get over to the mute button. I apologize, but I guess I'm really curious about your process of writing a poem every day and how in the heck you did that. I mean, I kept thinking, well, I couldn't do that. I mean, did you get up and say, okay, I'm going to write a poem today about my dog? Or, I mean, how did you do that, and how much time did you spend on that?
Yeah, good question. Not much time at all. I mean, really, it's as soon as I sat down at my desk in the morning and turned on my computer, that would be the first words that I'd put on a page, would be a poem. And, maybe calling it a poem loosely, not saying this is going to be a poem that will then get published, and it's more like a poem practice. And so I wrote a lot of poems about the birch tree outside my window, to whom the book is dedicated, by the way, because she watched over every word. And I wrote about dreams and what happened the day before, just whatever came into my mind. I would just pick something. Sometimes I would write based on poetry that I'd read or a science article that I might have read that week. Some of the poems in the book, for example, well, actually, for a while I was writing poems using as a title the title of these emails I was getting from space weather about goings on in space, auroras, comets, things like that. For a while they had, whoever was writing the titles for their emails was really good. And so actually the beating heart minus gravity comes from one of those emails. And I would just start with, some phrase or something like that and just see where it took me. But again, I saw it as writing practice, so I think that took the pressure off. I don't even think William Stafford, even though he wrote a poem every morning, I don't think he actually finished every single one of those poems and sent them out. I remember the poet Maxine Kumin talking about writing a lot of poems and a lot of them just going into what she called her box of bones, which was, literally for her a box on the floor where she'd put the poems that, maybe were attempts but never went anywhere. But then, if you have a moment where you're sitting at your desk and no ideas come to you, you have that box of bones that you can go to and dig around and pull something out and play around with it. So I would do that too. I would just have, stuff lying around on my desk that I would pick up some article or something and say, oh, what can I make of this?
So it looks like Nancy has joined us.
Oh, good.
Would you like me to pin Nancy?
Yes, please.
I am so sorry. I had technical difficulties, which I never have with Zoom, but it was, anyway, I'm here. So I really apologize, especially to Marybeth. Anyway, Marybeth, maybe you can just tell me very briefly what you've kind of covered so far.
Well, I read the first poem of the book and talked about the title and talked about how poetry infuses my life and my practice of writing a poem a day. Yeah. So,
great. Okay,
and I think Trish asked a little more about that. And Trish, if you unpin yourself and pin Nancy, then it'll show up as Nancy and I side by side.
Okay, well, in any case.
I believe I did that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Marybeth, I believe you're in North Carolina now, and I just wanted to talk to you because you have two home places. You haven't talked about this yet, have you? Okay, You're from North Carolina, and you've lived in Alaska for a long time, and you're obviously very attached to both places, especially here to the Chugach Mountains and Prince William Sound. So I just wonder if you could talk about what is it that you respond to in both places? How do these places sort of feed your spirit and then, infuse your writing, your poetry and other writing?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think, I grew up in Asheville, so I grew up in mountains. And so mountains are just in me. But our parents were wonderful and brave because they took all 6 of us kids to the coast, to the beach, a couple of times a year at least, and took us camping up in the mountains. And so they got us out a lot. And I think that was really important to my formation of myself, really. And I was a middle child, so I remember we'd go on long hikes in the mountains, and I'd linger towards the back of the line of people just to have a little time to myself. And so I always had this need for quiet and alone time, and being in the natural world was a really good place for that. I would climb up on the roof of my parents' garage and sit among the branches of the trees and just be alone up there. So North Carolina just, especially the mountains of North Carolina, but the coast too, was just a part of me. And, when I was growing up there, I really wanted to live somewhere where there were mountains and coast together. And so when I came to Alaska, and I remember as a kid, like flipping through the World Book and finding Argentina and thinking, oh, I should move there because the mountains and the coast are together. I don't know why I didn't find Alaska, but anyhow, when we came to Alaska just for summer jobs and I saw Prince William Sound and I saw the mountains just dropping into the sea, and I thought, well, this is it. Like, this is this place that I have always longed for, and that's how it felt. So it was pretty immediate falling in love. And I am strongly connected to both places. I mean, these old mountains, the old Appalachian Mountains, and their generous folds and curves, and then the new Chugach with their sharp angles and their bare peaks and the alpine meadows where you can just see for miles. It's just amazing. I mean, I just feel really fortunate to, have lived in both places and call both places home. So the mountains and the sea and the wild land, has always been important to me. I would never have ended up. Well, it's funny because Anchorage is the biggest city I've ever lived in. But I was going to say I'd never end up in a city, but there I am. So hope that answers it.
So, to follow up on that, Marybeth, well, first I want to remind everyone that we're going to open this to questions at about a quarter of the hour or so. So if you have questions, you can put them into the, where is it on here? It's in under reactions, there's a, we don't have a Q&A place, but under reactions, you can raise your hand. So be prepared to do that. I guess that's the way we'll do it. Or the chat box. That's probably the better. We have chat box where you are welcome to put in questions as you think of them. So Marybeth, yeah, the natural world is so important to you, and it just, comes through in all of your work, your prose as well as your poetry. But in this poetry collection, there's a huge sense of loss, at least that I felt, and I'm wondering if you used your poetry to sort of process your sense of loss, and or you wanted to convey to readers something about, encouraging them to find the beauty in the world. Or I guess what I'm asking is sort of, who's your audience here, and how much are you kind of writing for your own process? How much are you writing to send something out into the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like to think of my audience as every human being. Because I never really wanted to just write and not have anybody else read it. To me, it's a way of being of use in the world. I started out working in politics and science policy, and I just really wanted to be of use. I really wanted to leave the world a better place. And to me, what we seem to need is to reconnect to the world beyond our own skin, to reconnect to the more than human world. And so that's been my guiding light with all my work. And at the same time, Patty Ann Rogers wrote a really good piece about this a long time ago in what was called the American Nature Writing Newsletter and became ASLE, about, you want to let the place, you want to think about what questions you ask of the place and what answers you might get, and be open-ended. That line, I think it was E.M. Forrester who said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So I do go into it with a sense of, I don't know where this is going. And I do go into it with a sense of, how can I know what I think until I see what I write, which again has been attributed to several writers over the years. And it's kind of fun, I just don't really know. And the sense of loss comes in just because it just permeates right now. Well, Leopold said to be an environmentalist is to walk in a world of wounds. The more you know, the more you see, and the more loss you see, as well as all the beauty. And so I think it's important not to turn away from the loss, and at the same time not to turn away from the beauty as well, and to try to marry those two and reveal what remains, and encourage us to protect what remains too.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So that speaks right to, I have a favorite poem that you know in your collection, and it's where is it on my list here? Skating after many moons. And I wonder if you could read that to us. And I don't know if you can also show it
Yeah,
on the screen.
share my screen, I think. Where is that? Here it is.
And if you could read it and then maybe talk a little bit about how it came to you, you know, sort of what came first, or, you know, was it completely like,
Okay.
did it come all at once, or was it pieced together from different thoughts at different times?
Okay. All right. I'll read it first. Skating after many moons. It's a small lake, a pond really, or not even that, a wet meadow in summer where our one kind of frog, who contains some kind of antifreeze in its veins, lives. The only one can survive this far north, our only amphibian, only cold-blooded being. And when he was young, my boy, and I wanted to keep him awake to the world, we came here and listened to the frog chorus, recorded it for a scientist cataloging the city's frogs. We wanted to see how changing weather was changing them. Would there be more or less? Would they die out as summers dried? She gave us a recording so we'd know what to listen for, but there was no mistaking the tender, high notes, held and overlapping, like the rounds I sang at summer camp, calls unlike the looping lilt of birds. Now, when I stand on this frozen meadow, in white figure skates I got when I was just a girl, still in easy love with this world, I hear all that's held under ice since we recorded the frog chorus. My boy grown to a man who may or may not notice the frogs are leaving. When I stand here seeking the certainty a child feels about the world that holds her steady, a mother feels for her boy holding her hand as they cross the damp meadow and stand still, listening. When I move, clumsily, cautiously, afraid of reeling headfirst onto what might crack, my limbs begin to remember from my girlhood the few times the lake froze and my dad took all us kids there, swung us around, and that one time I skated with a friend who flew circles and arcs around my leaden feet. My limbs fling it all and swing me around and around until I am dizzy in love again, until the world is aright and all this keeps me twirling.
Thank you so much. That's just such a beautiful poem. So yeah, could you talk to us a little bit about how it came to you, how you constructed it?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot about how places hold memories, and this is a place that holds memories, and they were memories that expanded back to my girlhood. But this is a little meadow, you know, in Anchorage, and I was out there skating on it one day, literally in figure skates that I had brought with me from North Carolina. I grew up in Asheville, the Beaver Lake there used to freeze every now and then. I don't think it does anymore, but and Dad would take us all there. And so I just, this poem really just came to me all at once. I mean, it really did come as a whole. But I just started thinking about all the beauty and all the loss throughout, you know, my life, my son's life, what may be for him, thinking about how the world has changed, how it may change, that whole fear that I carry about what's happening with climate change, what's going to happen to our frogs, and you know how it felt when I grew up in a place where there were tons of, cold-blooded snakes and lizards and all kinds of frogs and toads, and moved to a place where there was just this one little guy. And so it's just a whole lot woven into that poem that it just all came together. And I, again, wanted, it brought it back to that sense of just joy in being here, like still getting to be here on this planet, even with all the loss, and just flinging it all and just letting loose and enjoying and flowing with it.
Great, thank you. So I'm curious too about the research you do for your poetry, because you have a lot of science, a lot of geology and astronomy in this book that I noted, and I'm just wondering, whether you mostly rely on your own experience and your own knowledge base, or do you do a bunch of research?
Well, it always starts from either an experience or something I've read, So, in that poem I just read, of course, when James was little and we did study for the frogs, that's, around that time was when I learned how this little frog survives winter and how amazing that is, and so a lot of times I'm always curious about the world and how things work. And so a lot of times my poems will arise from that. Like Anchorage has had a lot of rain the second half of summer. Well, I think all of South Central Alaska has. And I was out walking my dogs one day along our now paved street and picking up all these worms and carrying them off to the side because they were out there and they were going to get run over by cars. And they were, and then I started thinking when I got home, like, why were they out in the road? Like, what is that about? And what I'd learned before when I was young was they drown if the ground is so saturated, so they have to come to the surface. But I did some research on it and learned that now scientists think that's not the case, that worms don't drown, but that they use it to migrate. So they migrate when the ground is wet and they can move around, slide around more easily. And I just think, wow. I mean, it's like we're still learning about worms. There's still so much that we don't know. It's fascinating to me. So I do a lot of, I don't really call it research because I'm just learning about stuff. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with it or I'm going to do anything with it. But the geology poems, I love geology because I find solace in this expansion of time that geology gives us. This reminder of what a little sliver of, and in terms of astronomy and space, the same kind of thing, that expansion of space. Like, I don't know if any of you have seen the images from the web telescope that have come through recently, but I have on my tabs on my computer those images, and whenever something has been upsetting or I feel overwhelmed or freaked out, I just click on one of those images and just stare at it. And it's just, it's soothing. It's soothing to me to think of how vast the universe or the multiverses are, how much more is going on that we don't know about.
Great, yeah, thank you. So curious too about the variety of forms in your book. You've got some that have really long lines, kind of Whitman-esque. You've got some that are, blocks or bricks of prose, like as a prose poem. Some have stanzas, some are continuous, and some make creative use of white space. And also there's one in there, Culross Passage, 5 months after, that refers to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. That's a kind of an erasure poem in a way. You've crossed out words. So I wonder if you could talk to us about forms, how you find, how a poem finds its form for you. and whether that's sort of part of the initial construction or you work with it and later fit it in. And then after that, I wonder if you could read us the poem, another nature poem, which is the one Sphagnum, which I think is a good example of where you've used a particular form that fits the subject matter.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, one of the fun parts of moving from writing prose to writing poetry is, you can just, the form is really, it's just so fun to play around with that. And I've always been drawn to visual art. I'm not any good at it, but I love looking at it and I appreciate it. And I find a lot of power in it. So poetry is a visual form. And the fact is that you can do just about anything with it. And so my experimentations, have just been out of just pure pleasure. And I read a lot of other poets, and I look at, I think Brenda Hellman was one whose work, she has some very experimental forms in her poetry. And for example, the rock poem in this book, I think I'm grows out of looking at a lot of her poems and the things that she does with them. And so it's fun to play with forms. It creates a visual image and, visual art in a way. But the other thing that I find interesting about playing with forms is that because what I try to do in my work is to try to help us reconnect with or remember connection with the non-human world. And in prose, we're always working in this more confined structure of sentences and paragraphs. And I think that in poetry, because it's more open-ended, it might allow for the non-human to be more revealed, to speak more, if I may, to us, because we're just widening the cracks and allowing more different kinds of voices in that way. So I think there's something about the power of poetry to express the ineffable that I find really appealing.
Yeah. So would you mind reading that poem Sphagnum for us? And I don't know, can you show it?
Yeah, let me share that one. Let me see if I can, I'm going to do this. Okay. Share screen. There we go. So sphagnum is a type of moss. And again, I spent a lot of time with it before I did any research and learned more about it. I learned that it can hold 40 times its weight in water and that it pulls water up from deep below. So it actually helps the plants around it by bringing water up to the surface. I think that's astonishing. But anyhow, so this is the poem that came out of just, I literally was just sitting with this plant. I mean, there's some in a little bit of forest that I live on. Sphagnum. Imagine being able to pull water from deep below to surface where you live. Imagine being able to hold 40 times your weight of that which you most require. What if it were love? What if you could hold 40 times your weight in love? And what if in holding you expanded, buoyant and strong, more yourself?
Thank you.
Yes, the poem shows the depth of the plant. Yeah.
Was that part of your initial inspiration, or did you kind of find that after you had the words?
The form? No, I actually wrote it that way. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because, that's one of the poems that, well, even like Skating After Many Moons, I just wrote it. I didn't really like think, okay, I want to write, I want to make the lines short. I mean, I didn't logically think through it. It just happened that way. And then I looked at it and I saw, well, yes, there you are. That's that plant that goes deep, you know. So sometimes I feel like when I'm lucky, writing is like it's a collaborative for me. It's not just me. It's the sphagnum, it's the frog, it's the tree, it's all the other beings that I'm around and that I'm thinking about and caring about. And I like that idea, that sense that sometimes I'm just like a conduit through which they talk to us.
Right. So you're also in a conversation with other poets too, and you mentioned Brenda Hillman, and I'm just wondering what other poets have been especially important to you that you've learned from, and yeah, can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier before we got on, Nancy, Mary Oliver was the first poet that I read much of. And Jane Kenyon was also a really important early influence for me. And W.S. Merwin, there's a poem in here at a poetry reading, and it was at a poetry, he was the poet reading in that poem. I didn't name him in the poem because I thought, well, I wanted to leave it open-ended, but his work is really important. Jane Hirschfield, Camille Dungy is an incredible poet. Joy Harjo's poems are incredible, and her book Sunrise is really quite a thing. And then there's also Ross Gay and another contemporary poet, Layli Long Soldier. That's that kind of erasure poem that I did with the oil spill poem was inspired by a book she wrote called Prose, where she took a federal document about Native Americans and did a lot of erasure and a lot of unusual forms to look at it from the Native American point of view. And it's very powerful. So it's an excellent book. So lots of great poets in this country, and Walt Whitman too.
Yeah, great. Can you tell us what you're reading now? Like what's on your bedroom table?
Yeah, well, what I'm reading right now, because I'm in North Carolina, I'm getting ready to do a couple of events, and I'm doing one event in Brevard, North Carolina, where my mother-in-law lives, at this tiny liberal arts college called Brevard College. And I'm reading the book of poems by the professor there that I'm going to be reading with, and it's called Rare Wondrous Things. Her name is Elise Benzel. And it reminds me, Emily Wall, I should have mentioned to you, there's so many great Alaska poets as well, but it reminds me of Emily's book Fist, where Emily looked at Georgia O'Keeffe's life and wrote a book of poetry from her perspective, each poem being the name of one of her works of art. But this book, what Elise is doing is, I think the inspiration came when she was in Amsterdam. She came across an exhibit, Maria Sibylla Merian, who was a German naturalist in the mid 1600s. And she was a botanical illustrator. And she was the person who showed that butterflies came from caterpillars. so anyhow, Elise went through biography, but then Marion became lost to us, lost to science. She became somehow discredited, after her death, and so she wasn't part of science history for a long time, and her work is getting resurrected now. And Elise, using poetry, is resurrecting her work and the idea of that level of curiosity that, I think we see in a lot of the great women scientists, from Jane Goodall to Barbara McClintock, who open their minds to really look at things anew. So that's what I'm reading right now. Long story about it, but it's, I think, an interesting project, and kind of an interesting thing that poetry can do is to take, to take another look at a point in history or a person in history and let in a different angle of light.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I saw a show of her artwork years ago when I was in Amsterdam. They had a museum show and I had never heard of her, and was really blown away by it, and read a lot about her and saw more of her work when I came back. So I've never forgotten it. Anyway, we are ready to open to questions from others of you. You can use the chat box. You can use the little hand raising feature, or you can put on your audio and in your video, excuse me, and raise your hand in your little box if you have a question for Marybeth. Don't be shy about it. And while you're thinking, oh yeah,
I have one.
Lucienne, is that your name?
Well, that's actually, I don't know why that's up there. That's my daughter's name. My name's
Oh.
Lisa Couturier, but I don't know how to change the technology.
Okay.
I was wanted to speak to Marybeth about, when you say that when people think of poets and poetry, I tend to feel that people think it's it looks so difficult. It's like intellectual practice. And I'm wondering if Marybeth could speak to how another way of looking at it is it's very bodily. I think the word sonnet actually comes from the word sound, like the body's soundings, and to speak about poetry in its relationship to the body and to just a female body, especially in today's world, and poetry as a response from what's deep inside of us and not just in our heads. That probably doesn't make any sense, but.
No, it's a good question. And it's appropriate coming from Lisa, who is an excellent poet herself, and has a book of poetry and a collection of essays called The Hopes of Snakes. But yeah, Lisa, I think that, that's why I think Mary Oliver spoke to me at first, because I thought poetry was more intellectual and difficult and, not accessible. And a lot of people talk about that, how they were forced to read poetry when they were in school and they didn't get it. And so just the idea that someone can say, I don't get poetry, is too bad, because one, poetry is this really big thing, and there's so many different kinds of poems within that there's a whole lot of poetry that I can read, and it just kind of, it doesn't connect, and I might read it 5 times and then maybe I might get something out of it. Then other poets, poetry I get right away. And I do think that writing from a more bodily experience is definitely what I do, and what I find most appealing in the work of others, because we live in our heads so much that I think that's part of the disconnect. That's part of why we don't relate to all these other beautiful forms of life around us, because we're so stuck in our minds. And when we get in our bodies, then it's really easy. It's not hard to relate, not hard at all. And that's why, people that have dogs as pets and love them fiercely, my sister Carolyn does, and my friend Allison, they just get it, because we have this relationship and it's very easy, and it translates beyond the boundaries of the pet to all the other living world. And so I think that poetry doesn't need to be that hard. It doesn't need to be that hard to write, and it doesn't need to be that hard to read, or to understand, or to appreciate when it comes from that more bodily experience. I think Adrienne Rich was a poet that really opened that up for people too. She started out writing very formally, rhyming, kind of working in the man's world of poetry, the academic world. And then she just started letting loose, and she wrote these beautiful poems like Diving into the Wreckage, which is just, her poems you can go back to and read them 20 times over 20 years and find new things. They're awesome. And she just allowed herself to open that way.
Thank you.
Right. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Yes, Carolyn Servid.
I have a question, kind of. Mary Beth, it strikes me that you aren't just a poet, you're a researcher as well. You know, when I hear your poems and I hear you talk about it, and I guess I wonder where in your process the research occurs. You know, I guess I'm just wondering how writing the poetry and doing the research kind of blend or meld or whatever. You know, does the poem come out of the research? Do you write a poem and then you go research? I don't know. I don't know how it's making sense, but I just see a lot of research behind your poetry, and I'm really impressed by that. You're like a science person's poet in a way. Some of your poems, you know.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that, Trish. And I think again that it just, I mean, I'm just constantly, like I read science magazines and I'm just constantly curious. And so then when I learn about something like the story I told earlier about learning about the worms, I have not written a poem about worms yet, but I might, and I think it's just being curious about the world and then learning about it and learning more by the things that we know and the things we don't know. And the poems just kind of rise out of there. But I definitely do make sure that, I guess you call it fact check. I do go back after and make sure that I got it right about the wood frog or, whatever other being that I have in my poem.
We'll go to Carolyn Servid, and then Holly has a question in the chat. Carolyn?
Hi, Mary Beth. Thank you. What a lovely, lovely chance to spend time with you all and hear your poems and hear about the book. I'm really delighted to be here, but not but and. I have this line that I've kept in my head for a long, long time from Robert Frost. It's in an essay of his, actually, where he talks about a poem being like a piece of ice on a hot stove riding on its own melting. And I think of that as a process kind of thing, not just in poetry. It certainly is true for me I write primarily nonfiction prose, but I'm just wondering if you start out, or if poems just sort of take you where they want you to go rather than you're actually controlling them as much as you might think you would like to. If it is a process of discovery as you go along, or is it more a shaping that you manage to do because you have an idea of where you'd like it to go?
Yeah. It's definitely the former. It's definitely that it just takes me where it wants to go. And was it A.R. Ammons who says, I look for the form the thing wants to come as? That's how I think of the poems, is that I just, and Skating After May is a good example of that. I mean, I just kind of started and it just flowed, and I didn't really, I like that. I like that surprise. I like that mystery. And I think that that's really important. I do, of course, revise a lot, and and tinker and endlessly tinker with individual words and the shape of the phrase and what images work and what don't, and that's just that's just part of you really honing the craft. But the initial impulse is certainly just the flow, sure.
I guess I just like to think about that because it says something to me about the process is really quite mysterious. We think we have such control over these things that we create, and yet there's something else at work that we can't really name and have to trust a lot, feels like to me. And that's what's so beautiful for me in a lot of poetry, is imagining that the poem wrote the writer. Sorry, that's not quite an accurate way to put it, but somehow that there's some other force at work that the writer is. If you pay attention, if you listen to it, it offers you so much.
Yeah.
So we'll go to
Thanks,
Holly, but
Karen.
first, I'm not sure what we did for an introduction of Marybeth at the beginning, but I think everyone knows that this is her first poetry book, but she's, of course, she's written poems and published poems for years and until this point, but she's also known as a prose writer with a memoir, The Heart of the Sound, and book about wolves that she co-wrote, and then she also edited an anthology, and she's published lots of essays and other things too. So Holly, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Marybeth. What a wonderful reading and so many great insights. I'm just thinking about your beautiful prose too, and I'm just wondering how writing poetry is informing your prose. If your approach to writing prose has changed at all, or if you're mostly writing poetry these days.
Oh no, I'm still writing prose too. I use all the tools in my toolbox. So I think that reading poetry definitely influences my prose, and now writing it as well, for sure. If you look at The Heart of the Sound, there's little prose pieces in between the longer chapters, really brief prose pieces that could just as easily be called prose poems, I think, because they're really focused on a particular moment in time or a particular image, and in them I'm trying to reveal the place. And so that might be when I was writing those and trying how to make it be more than just a book about me, but a book about the place, and to reveal the place. How those short pieces were things that I discovered to help me with that. And so I think out of that grew more interest in the power of poetry and writing it, and how that could help me. But I think, just paying attention to language. And that's why Jane Kenyon's advice of, having good sentences in your ears is so useful. That if we just have good language in our ears, in what we write and in what we read and what we think about, then that helps our writing, whether it's prose or poetry or something else, playwriting.
Thank you, Marybeth. I just want to say I love those kind of prose poem pieces in Heart of the Sound. And so it makes, I love the way you kind of move so beautifully between those two genres, and the way that they really can come together in the hands of a skilled practitioner like you. So thank you.
Well, we're getting towards the end. Marybeth, I think that your publisher has offered a special deal for your book. Do you want to mention that? And I don't know if it's possible to put it into the chat.
Yeah, maybe Trish, if you could she put it in at the beginning of the chat, but
okay, good.
Red Hat Press is offering a 25% discount to folks that come to these events, and it's in the chat, the discount code that you can use to get a copy of my book from Red Hen Press. So please do, or go to your local bookstore and get one from them.
Yeah, right. Here it is with beautiful cover. Do you want to tell us about the cover briefly?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so I said I love visual art, but I'm not very good at it. So this is by an Alaska painter. Her name is Linda Infante Lyons, and Linda is she's part. Her grandmother is an Alutiiq from Kodiak Island, and so she has that heritage in her. And in doing her painting, it comes through in a lot of her work. And I have loved her work long time. And I actually took a plein air class from her years and years ago at Western Lagoon. I always wanted to do that, sit outside with an easel and paint what was in front of me. But she's a wonderful person and an incredible artist. And so when I was thinking about a cover for my book, I immediately thought of her artwork and So I just asked her if we could use this in particular because it has the pushki and the islands and the water, which is so prevalent in the book, and then the beautiful sky that we get in northern latitudes. So yes, Linda's artwork is amazing, and I'm just so delighted that she let me use that for her cover.
Right. Well, thank you, Marybeth, and thank you everyone for spending this hour with us. Marybeth, you have something, some final, anything that you'd like to say?
Well, I just want to thank all of you for being here, and thank everyone for reading poetry, and thank everyone for loving this gorgeous planet that we get to inhabit, that we're lucky enough to be here on. And I think that's it.
So the program has been recorded, and so it'll be put up on the Alaska Book Week site, so you can see it again. I might need to see the beginning that I missed. And you can share it with others too. So hope that you'll do that. Okay, well, I guess we can sign off. We got lots of thank yous there in the chat, and this was really lovely. And enjoy your time back there in the East, Marybeth, and come back to us.
I will.
Really
All right.
inspired.
Thank you.